In the middle of a bustling city square, Nora Albright, a fiery activist and self-proclaimed defender of justice, points an accusing finger at an elderly man in military attire. "Fascist!" she shouts, her voice echoing. The crowd gasps, watching the stoic veteran, Malcolm Hayes, remain eerily calm. What starts as a heated confrontation spirals into a rollercoaster of revelations, forcing everyone to question their beliefs. By the end, no one, not even Nora, will be the same. The sun shone brightly over the city square, casting long shadows as people strolled about, enjoying the crisp air. Among the crowd, Nora Albright, a fiery activist in her early 30s, stood out. Her blazing red hair and defiant green eyes mirrored her unyielding convictions. Fresh from a heated activist meeting, her mind buzzed with the echoes of impassioned debates. She was ready to fight for what she believed in, and today she found her target. Sitting on a bench near the fountain was an elderly man. His military uniform, adorned with gleaming medals, caught the sunlight like a beacon. To Nora, he wasn't just a veteran. He was a symbol of everything wrong with the world: war, oppression, blind nationalism. Her anger flared. Without hesitation, she marched toward him, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the square. "Fascist!" she shouted, her words hanging in the air. Heads turned, conversations ceased, and the crowd began to form a circle. The man looked up from his book, startled but composed. He closed it gently, placing it on his lap, and regarded her with calm, steady eyes. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "You heard me," Nora snapped, planting her hands on her hips. "Sitting here, flaunting those medals like there's something to be proud of. Do you even realize what you represent?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression curious. "And what do you believe I represent, young lady?" "Violence. Oppression. The very system that destroys lives," she retorted. Her voice carried the weight of her convictions, and the crowd began to murmur, their curiosity growing. The man, still composed, asked, "Do you know my name?" "I don't need to," Nora shot back. "Your uniform says everything I need to know." By now, the crowd had thickened, their whispers a mixture of disapproval and agreement. A young man with a smartphone began recording the scene, his camera trained on the confrontation. The man gestured to the empty space on the bench beside him. "Would you like to sit and talk about this?" "Talk?" Nora's voice rose in disbelief. "What's there to talk about? You're part of a system that thrives on oppression, and you expect me to have a polite conversation with you." The man remained unflappable. "I'm not asking for politeness. I'm asking for a conversation. I'd like to understand your perspective." Nora hesitated, thrown off by his calm demeanor. But the eyes of the crowd were on her, and she couldn't back down. "Fine," she said, sitting at the far edge of the bench, keeping her distance. "But don't think for a second that I'm letting you off the hook." The man extended his hand. "My name is Malcolm Hayes." "I don't care," Nora replied coldly. Malcolm withdrew his hand without comment. "All right, and what's your name?" "Nora," she said curtly. "Well, Nora," Malcolm began, "what is it that you think I've done to deserve this kind of accusation?" "You served in the military," Nora said sharply. "That alone makes you complicit in every act of violence carried out in its name. You enforced the will of the powerful and crushed anyone who stood in your way." Malcolm listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he asked, "And do you believe that everyone who serves does so for the same reasons, with the same outcomes?" "The system is corrupt," Nora said firmly. "Anyone who participates in it is guilty." Malcolm nodded thoughtfully. "And have you spoken to many veterans about their experiences?" "I don't need to," Nora snapped. "Their actions speak louder than their excuses." After a moment's pause, Malcolm said, "May I share a bit about myself?" "Go ahead," Nora said, folding her arms. "I'm sure you've got a sob story to justify yourself." Malcolm sighed, his voice soft but steady. "I joined the military at 18. At the time, I believed I was doing the right thing, serving my country, protecting people. But war, it teaches you things you never wanted to learn. When I came home, I couldn't let those experiences define me. So I decided to dedicate my life to helping others. For the past 20 years, I've worked with veterans suffering from PTSD and with at-risk youth trying to escape cycles of violence. The crowd listened intently now, the earlier murmurs fading into silence. Nora's fiery expression faltered for a moment, though she quickly recovered. "And that's supposed to erase the harm you've done?" she challenged. "No," Malcolm said quietly. "Nothing can erase the past. But every day, I try to do better. My question is, do you?" The words hit Nora harder than she expected. For the first time, she hesitated, her convictions shaken. The crowd, sensing the shift, held their breath, waiting for her response. Malcolm continued, "It's easy to criticize and accuse. It's much harder to listen and learn. I'm not here to argue with you, Nora. I'm here to understand why you believe what you do. Maybe we're not as different as you think." Nora's eyes narrowed, her defenses rising again. "We have nothing in common." "Maybe not," Malcolm admitted, "but perhaps we could start by seeing each other as people instead of symbols. Isn't that the first step toward real change?" The crowd watched in silence, the tension in the air thick. And for the first time, Nora found herself questioning whether she was truly the hero in this story. The city square had quieted, but the video of the confrontation between Nora and Malcolm was already spreading like wildfire online. By nightfall, the internet was ablaze with polarized opinions. One camp hailed Nora as a bold truth-teller, standing up to the symbols of oppression. The other saw her as ignorant and disrespectful, targeting a man she didn't know. Nora watched the unfolding drama with a mix of pride and unease, glued to her phone as comments poured in. "You're a hero," one comment read. "Finally, someone who isn't afraid to call out the lies of patriotism." But the next comment stung. "You don't even know what this man has done. You're all talk, no understanding." Nora's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to fire back, but a message notification stopped her. It was from a friend who had shared the video. "Have you seen this? He's not who you think he is," the message read, accompanied by a link. Nora hesitated before clicking it. The link led to an article about Malcolm Hayes. It wasn't what she expected. The headline wasn't about war crimes or oppression. It was about a community center he had founded for at-risk youth. The article detailed how Malcolm had spent decades working with veterans suffering from PTSD and mentoring young people to keep them out of gangs. Nora's stomach churned. Could this be the same man she had confronted? She slammed her laptop shut, trying to shake the feeling of doubt creeping into her mind. "It doesn't matter," she muttered to herself. "Whatever he's done after doesn't erase what he was part of." But the seeds of uncertainty had been planted. The next day, Nora's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. She glanced at it to see a message from an unfamiliar number. "I'm hosting an event tomorrow at the community center. I'd like you to come. Malcolm." Her heart skipped a beat. How had he gotten her number? And why was he inviting her? Was this a trap to make her look bad? Her first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of her. Against her better judgment, she typed a curt reply. "Fine, I'll be there." The community center was nothing like Nora had imagined. She had expected a dreary, institutional building, but what she found was a vibrant space filled with laughter and color. Murals covered the walls, painted by local kids, and the scent of freshly baked cookies wafted from the kitchen. Children ran past her giggling, while a group of teens sat in a circle, deep in discussion. Malcolm spotted her as she lingered near the entrance, unsure of what to do. He waved her over with a warm smile. "Nora, you made it." She crossed her arms, trying to mask her unease. "I'm not staying long." "Fair enough," he said. "But before you go, let me show you something." He led her to a room where a group of veterans was gathered, talking in low voices. One of them, a burly man with a weathered face, was sharing his story. "I thought I'd never get my life back after the things I saw. But this place, it gave me a purpose again." Nora's resolve wavered. She wanted to dismiss it as propaganda, but the sincerity in the man's voice was undeniable. Malcolm leaned closer to her. "Every one of these people has a story. Some of them made mistakes. Some of them did things they regret. But they're here because they're trying to be better. Isn't that worth something?" Before she could answer, a teenage girl approached them. "Mr. Hayes, can I show her my painting?" "Of course, Mia," Malcolm said with a nod. The girl led Nora to a mural she had been working on. It depicted a phoenix rising from ashes, surrounded by words like hope, healing, and redemption. "I painted this after Mr. Hayes helped me get out of a bad situation," Mia said. "I was in with the wrong crowd, but he believed in me when no one else did." Nora felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know what to say. For the first time, she wondered if her black-and-white worldview had left her blind to the shades of gray. By the time she left the community center, Nora's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. She had come here expecting to find more reasons to vilify Malcolm, but instead, she had found a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. It didn't erase her anger at the system he had been part of, but it made her question whether she had been too quick to judge. That night, she sat at her desk, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen. Her followers were waiting for her next post, expecting her to double down on her stance. But for the first time, she wasn't sure what to say. Finally, she began to type. "Yesterday, I met a man who I thought represented everything I stood against, but what I found was more complicated than I expected." Her words trailed off as she struggled to articulate what she was feeling. This wasn't the clarity she was used to. It was messy, uncomfortable, and deeply human. Nora closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was truly learning something. The sun was setting as Nora paced around her small apartment, her thoughts tangled in a web of self-doubt. The meeting at the community center had shaken her. Every instinct told her to double down, to hold on to her convictions. And yet, Malcolm's words and the stories she had heard lingered in her mind like a splinter she couldn't remove. Her laptop sat open, notifications flooding her inbox. Her followers urged her to stay strong and keep fighting. Nora's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the words wouldn't come. That evening, she received a message from Malcolm. "I'd like to share more of my story. Sometimes understanding takes more than one conversation." She stared at it, her frustration mingled with curiosity. Against her better judgment, she replied, "Fine. When?" "Tomorrow morning. Meet me at the Veterans Memorial in the park," he replied. The next day, Nora arrived at the memorial unsure of what to expect. The air was crisp, and the morning light cast long shadows over the engraved names. Malcolm stood silently before the memorial. He turned when she approached, offering a small smile. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I'm not here to make peace," Nora replied curtly. Malcolm chuckled softly. "I didn't expect you to." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the names hanging between them. Finally, Malcolm gestured toward a bench nearby. Nora followed reluctantly. "I think it's important for you to understand what brought me here, to this life, to this place." "I was 18 when I enlisted," Malcolm began. "I grew up in a small town where patriotism was a given. Joining the military seemed like the right thing to do. It wasn't until I was deployed that I started to see the cracks in what I believed." He paused, his gaze distant. "War isn't glory. It's survival. And when it was over, I came back to a country that didn't know what to do with me. I didn't know what to do with myself." Nora's arms were crossed, but her expression softened slightly. "I struggled for years," he continued. "PTSD, survivor's guilt, you name it. I couldn't hold a job or keep relationships, but wallowing in guilt wouldn't change anything. If I wanted to make things right, I had to do something." He gestured toward the community center, visible in the distance. "That's why I started the center, to give people like me a second chance, to help kids avoid the mistakes I made. It doesn't erase the past, but it's a step forward." Nora's voice was quieter than she intended when she spoke. "And you think that's enough? That it makes up for everything?" "No," Malcolm said simply, "but it's not about making up for the past. It's about deciding what kind of person I want to be now." As they sat there, a group of children approached the memorial, led by a young woman carrying papers. Malcolm introduced Nora to the group, explaining that the kids were writing essays about veterans whose names were on the memorial. One boy held up his paper proudly. "I wrote about my uncle," he said. "He was really brave." Nora felt a pang of discomfort. She had spent so much time railing against symbols like this memorial that she had never considered the personal stories behind them. These weren't just names on a wall. They were people with lives, families, dreams. After the group left, Malcolm turned back to her. "You don't have to agree with everything I've done or even like me, but I hope you'll consider that the world isn't as black and white as we sometimes want it to be." Nora didn't reply. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, and for the first time she wasn't sure if she could justify the simplicity of her worldview. Malcolm wasn't asking her to abandon her beliefs, but his quiet persistence was forcing her to question how she applied them. That evening, Nora noticed the video of her confrontation with Malcolm had been edited and reposted by a popular commentator. It painted Malcolm as a hero and Nora as the villain. She closed the app, frustration rising. This wasn't what she wanted. The truth wasn't that simple. Malcolm wasn't her enemy, but he wasn't a flawless hero either. She felt trapped, caught between the expectations of her followers and the reality she was beginning to see. Nora opened her laptop. Her audience wanted a resolution, but she had none to offer. Instead, she began to write, not for them, but for herself. "The truth is messy," she typed. "It doesn't fit neatly into the narratives we create. Today, I learned that understanding takes more than one conversation. It takes time, humility, and the willingness to admit when you might be wrong." Her words trailed off, but for the first time, she felt a sliver of clarity. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she was finally willing to walk it. The days following her meeting with Malcolm were a blur of conflicting emotions for Nora. She tried to throw herself back into her activism, attending rallies and planning campaigns, but something was off. Her passion, the fire that had driven her for so long, felt muted. The certainty she had once carried with her was now clouded by questions she couldn't answer. Her followers, oblivious to her inner turmoil, continued to praise her for the confrontation with Malcolm. "You're a warrior," one comment read. "Don't let the haters get to you." Another said, "That man's just another relic of a broken system. Don't let him fool you." But for every message of support, there were others that criticized her. "Do you even know what he's done for his community?" one commenter asked. "You're just looking for someone to blame." Nora had never cared much about criticism before, but now it gnawed at her. Malcolm's words and actions had created a crack in her armor, and the more she thought about it, the wider it grew. One evening, as she scrolled through her social media feed, she came across another video of Malcolm. This one wasn't about their confrontation. It was a recording of him speaking at an event for veterans, sharing his story and encouraging others to seek help and support. His voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in it that struck her. "We all have things we regret," he said in the video, "but we can't let those regrets define us. What matters is what we do now, with the time we have left." Nora paused the video, staring at the frozen image of Malcolm on her screen. She didn't want to admit it, but his words resonated with her. For years, she had been driven by anger. Anger at the system, at those she saw as complicit in it, at the injustices she couldn't ignore. But what had she done with that anger, beyond shouting and pointing fingers? The next morning, Nora found herself back at the community center. She hadn't planned on going, but something had drawn her there. She lingered outside for a moment, debating whether to go in, when she spotted Malcolm through the window. He was sitting at a table with a group of teenagers, laughing as they worked on a project together. Nora hesitated, then took a deep breath and walked inside. Malcolm noticed her almost immediately and stood to greet her. "Nora," he said, surprised but welcoming. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't either," she admitted. "But I have questions." Malcolm nodded, gesturing for her to join him at the table. The teenagers greeted her with curious smiles, and Malcolm introduced them one by one. They were working on a mural for the center, he explained, something to represent hope and resilience. As the teenagers returned to their work, Malcolm turned to Nora. "What questions do you have?" Nora hesitated, unsure where to begin. Finally, she asked, "How do you reconcile what you've done with what you're doing now? Doesn't it ever feel like it's not enough?" "All the time," Malcolm admitted. "But I've learned that we can't change the past. All we can do is try to be better, to make the future a little brighter for the people around us." "And what about the system you were part of?" she pressed. "The one that caused so much harm?" Malcolm's expression grew serious. "I don't deny that the system is flawed. Deeply flawed. But change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen from the sidelines. I chose to work from where I could, to try to make a difference in the lives I could touch. It's not perfect, but it's something." Nora fell silent, mulling over his words. She had always believed that tearing down the system was the only way to create change. But was there value in what Malcolm was doing? Working within the cracks, helping individuals rather than trying to fix the whole? As the afternoon wore on, Nora stayed at the center, observing and occasionally joining in the conversations. She listened to the teenagers share their dreams and struggles, watched Malcolm encourage them with patience and understanding. For the first time, she saw him not as a symbol of the system she despised, but as a person trying to make amends in his own way. When she finally left, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. Nora walked home slowly, her mind racing. She didn't have answers yet, but she felt like she was beginning to understand the questions better. That night, she sat at her desk, staring at her laptop. Her followers were waiting for her next post, but she couldn't give them what they wanted. Instead, she opened a blank document and began to write for herself. "Today, I realized that change isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's about the small, quiet acts of kindness that ripple outward. It's about finding humanity in the people you least expect and recognizing that we're all just trying to do the best we can." Her words trailed off, but for the first time, she felt a sense of purpose beyond anger. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but she was finally ready to find out. Weeks passed, and Nora found herself returning to the community center more often than she had expected. At first, it was just to observe, to try and make sense of what Malcolm was doing, but slowly, she began to engage. She started helping the teenagers with their mural, sitting in on discussions, and even tutoring a young boy struggling with schoolwork. Some of the kids recognized her from the viral video, but Malcolm had clearly instructed them not to bring it up. Instead, they welcomed her with an openness she hadn't anticipated. It was disarming, but also comforting. One afternoon, as she helped mix paint for the mural, Malcolm approached her. "How are you finding it here?" he asked. Nora hesitated. "It's different," she admitted. "I didn't expect to feel so welcomed." Malcolm nodded. "This place is about second chances, for everyone. Not just the kids, but for people like me, too, and maybe for people like you." The words caught her off guard. "I didn't think I needed a second chance," she said defensively. "Maybe not," Malcolm said with a small smile, "but sometimes we all need a new perspective." That evening, Nora sat in her apartment reflecting on Malcolm's words. She had spent so much of her life fighting against what she saw as the injustices of the world. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she had been too focused on the fight and not enough on the people. Her laptop was open, and her social media notifications were relentless. Her followers were still waiting for her to post, to take a stand, to tell them what to think. But Nora hesitated. She wasn't sure she had the answers anymore. She scrolled through her feed, stopping at a post about the viral video of her confrontation with Malcolm. The comments were as polarized as ever, some praising her bravery, others condemning her ignorance. She closed the tab, frustrated. For years, she had seen the world in black and white, but now shades of gray were creeping in, and it was unsettling. She felt untethered, unsure of where she stood. The next day, Malcolm invited her to join him on a visit to a local shelter. "I think you might find it interesting," he said, "and I think the people there might benefit from meeting you." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Meeting me? Why?" "Because you're passionate," Malcolm replied, "and passion, when it's guided, can do incredible things." Curiosity got the better of her, and she agreed to go. The shelter was a modest building on the outskirts of the city, run by a small team of volunteers. Inside, Nora met people from all walks of life: veterans, single parents, runaway teens, each with their own story. Malcolm explained how the shelter partnered with the community center to provide resources and support. One of the volunteers, a woman named Clara, shared her story. She had been a single mother living on the streets until the shelter helped her get back on her feet. Now, she worked there as a counselor, helping others who were in the position she had once been in. "It's not about fixing everything," Clara said. "It's about doing what you can for the people in front of you." The words stayed with Nora long after she left the shelter. That evening, she found herself at her desk again, staring at the blinking cursor on her screen. The tension between her old convictions and her evolving perspective was almost unbearable. Her followers expected certainty, but all she had were questions. Finally, she began to type. "For years, I've believed that the only way to create change was to fight, to tear down systems and expose injustice. But today, I learned that change can also be quiet. It can be about building, about healing, about helping the person in front of you." Her words came slowly, but with each sentence she felt a little more clarity. She wasn't abandoning her beliefs, she was expanding them. The following week, Nora joined Malcolm at a community event. It was a small gathering, with people from the shelter and the community center coming together to share stories, music, and food. For the first time in a long time, Nora felt a sense of belonging. She listened as people shared their struggles and triumphs, their pain and hope. When it was her turn to speak, she stood hesitantly, unsure of what to say. "I used to think that the world was simple," she began, "that there were good guys and bad guys, right and wrong. But I'm learning that it's not that simple. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the messiness is where we find our humanity." Her voice wavered, but the room erupted in applause. Malcolm gave her an approving nod, and for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. Not the easy path, but the right one. As the evening wound down, Malcolm approached her. "You've come a long way, Nora." She smiled. "I still have a long way to go." "That's the point," Malcolm said. "The journey never really ends, but you're walking it, and that's what matters." Nora looked around the room, at the faces of the people she had come to know. She didn't have all the answers, but she was beginning to see that maybe she didn't need them. Change wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being willing to ask the questions. Months had passed since Nora's confrontation with Malcolm in the city square. In that time, her life had shifted in ways she never could have imagined. The Nora who had once seen the world in stark black and white now embraced its complexities. She realized her beliefs weren't wrong, but they were incomplete, and the journey to completeness was a path she was still walking. The community center had become a second home. She continued to volunteer, forging connections with the kids and their families, but more importantly, she started asking herself the hard questions. What was she fighting for? Who was she trying to help? And how could she make a difference without being consumed by anger? Her relationship with Malcolm had grown. While they didn't always agree, their conversations had become a space for learning and growth. Malcolm respected her fire, and she had come to admire his patience. Together, they challenged each other in ways that made them both better. One day, Malcolm invited her to a meeting with local leaders. "I think it's time you start sharing your perspective with more people," he said. Nora hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "You don't have to have all the answers," Malcolm said. "You just have to be willing to speak and listen." The meeting was held in a small conference room. Nora sat at the table, surrounded by community leaders, activists, and city officials. She felt out of place, but when the conversation turned to the challenges facing their city, homelessness, youth violence, lack of resources, she found herself speaking up. "These issues aren't just problems to solve," she said. "They're symptoms of a system that's failing people. But I've learned that change doesn't come from yelling at the system. It comes from working with the people who are affected by it." Her words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. For the first time, Nora felt like she was being heard, not as a provocateur, but as someone with ideas worth considering. After the meeting, one of the city officials approached her. "You have a lot of passion," he said. "Have you ever thought about working on policy? We need voices like yours at the table." The idea of stepping into a formal role had never crossed her mind. She had always seen herself as an outsider, someone who worked against the system, not within it. But the conversation planted a seed. Nora continued her work at the community center. One evening, she and Malcolm organized a family night, inviting kids, parents, and volunteers to share a meal and celebrate their progress. As she looked around the room, she was struck by how far she had come since that day in the square. A teenage girl approached her, holding a small notebook. "Miss Nora, can I ask you something?" she said shyly. "Of course," Nora replied, kneeling down to meet her gaze. "What made you change your mind about Mr. Hayes?" the girl asked. Nora smiled softly. "I didn't change my mind about him. I changed my mind about myself. I realized I wasn't really listening to people. I was too busy trying to prove I was right." The girl nodded thoughtfully. "I want to help people like you do." "You can," Nora said. "You already are." Months turned into a year, and Nora's transformation continued. She decided to take the city officials' advice and began working on a local initiative to increase funding for community programs. The work was slow and often frustrating, but it was also rewarding. Her voice carried weight, not because she was the loudest, but because she was willing to listen. Her online presence changed as well. She no longer posted inflammatory rants. Instead, she used her platform to share stories of hope and resilience, highlighting the work being done by people like Malcolm and Clara. Some followers left, but many stayed, drawn to her authenticity and willingness to grow. One day, Malcolm called her over after a meeting at the community center. "I've been thinking," he said. "You've been doing a lot of good here, but I think it's time for you to take the lead." Nora frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm not going to be around forever," Malcolm said. "This place needs someone with your energy and vision, someone who can keep it alive and growing." The idea scared her, but it also excited her. She wasn't sure if she was ready to take on such a responsibility, but she knew she couldn't turn away from it. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I ask," Malcolm replied. As Nora walked home that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the girl she had been when she first shouted at Malcolm in the square. Angry, righteous, certain she had all the answers. And she thought about the woman she was becoming, still passionate but more thoughtful, more willing to listen and learn. The world was still messy, still unfair, still full of systems that needed to be challenged. But Nora had learned that real change didn't come from shouting at the world. It came from working with people, from building bridges instead of burning them. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the right path, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. And she knew she still had a long way to go.